Forget the white hat cowboys and polite shootouts. The Wild West Hollywood sold you was a Sunday school picnic compared to the brutal, blood-soaked sagas some filmmakers actually dared to make in the 1960s. Ever wonder which westerns rattled censors so hard they reached for the scissors and sometimes just hit the ban button? What happens when the bullets hit bone, the camera doesn't flinch, and the violence feels almost too real? Saddle up, because these are the westerns that pushed it way too far.
Django, 1966.
If you've ever wondered why Italian westerns have such a cult following, start with Sergio Corbucci's Django. Forget John Wayne's straight-backed swagger. Here comes Franco Nero dragging a coffin through the mud, looking like death warmed over. And what's in the coffin? Let's just say it's not Grandma's china. By the time Django pops it open, censors everywhere were already reaching for their red pens. Django wasn't just violent for the sake of shock. It took brutality and made it a character. Machine gun massacres, sadistic beatings, men getting their ears sliced off and fed to them. This film made every other western of its era look like a polite card game at the local church. The infamous scene where Django's hands are smashed to pulp, audiences in the UK and Scandinavia had to make do without it. The censors just cut it right out. In fact, the UK kept the film banned for decades. And that's not even getting into the mass grave finale, a set piece so grim and unrelenting, it felt like the apocalypse had arrived in the Old West. But here's the punchline. The violence in Django wasn't random, and it wasn't just for kicks. Corbucci was the airing down the clean, heroic myth of the American cowboy. Every splatter, every betrayal, every mud-soaked showdown was a middle finger to Hollywood's sanitized legends. By the end, you're left with a western that feels like a fever dream, a movie so dangerous it was practically illegal to enjoy. And that's exactly why it became an underground legend, paving the way for every bloody, muddy, lawless western that followed. The Great Silence, 1968. When it comes to westerns that bite, few have sharper teeth than Sergio Corbucci's The Great Silence. Picture this, a snowbound landscape, a mute gunslinger with eyes like ice, and a villain so cold-hearted he could freeze whiskey. Forget the sunny plains. Corbucci plants his characters in the dead of winter, where hope is a luxury, and survival isn't guaranteed. From the first frame, you know you're in for something different, and censors knew it too. Here's the thing. This movie isn't just bleak, it's a punch in the gut. Jean-Louis Trintignant's silence stalks his enemies with quiet intensity, never speaking a word, while Klaus Kinski's Loco grins his way through torture and murder. The violence isn't flashy, it's raw, sudden, and utterly merciless. Villagers get gunned down in the snow, throats are slit, and even the supposed heroes get no mercy. The infamous ending? Let's just say the bad guys win, brutally. Audiences expecting a classic showdown walked out looking like they'd seen a ghost. The Great Silence was deemed too much for 1960s American sensibilities. 20th Century Fox, who financed the film, outright refused to release it in the US. Too violent, too hopeless, too much, they said. European audiences were left shaken and critics split. Some hailed it as genius, others called it nihilism for its own sake. The studio even demanded an alternate happy ending for TV, which Corbucci shot but refused to use in his preferred cut. Decades later, The Great Silence stands as a monument to how dark the Western could get when a director stopped playing by the rules. Its violence isn't just shocking, it's a deliberate slap in the face to everything you thought you knew about heroes, villains, and the American West. A Fistful of Dollars, 1964. You think all westerns before the late 60s were tame. Enter Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars, the film that didn't just rewrite the rules, it shot holes in the old playbook. Clint Eastwood, squinting in his poncho, strolls into a town where every handshake hides a dagger and every smirk signals trouble. But here's the twist. This wasn't just a new breed of hero, it was a new level of cinematic violence, and censors worldwide didn't know what hit them. Right from the start, Leone's camera refuses to look away. Men are shot point blank, faces are bloodied, and brutality is served up with an unflinching gaze. The infamous Rojo compound burning scene, American censors trimmed it, fearing audiences couldn't handle the images of men being burned alive. The sadistic beating Eastwood's character endures left viewers squirming and censors twitching for the scissors. Even the gunfights, stylized and operatic, felt vicious compared to the staged theatrics of Hollywood's golden era. What really rattled the censors, though, was the film's moral ambiguity. There are no clean-cut heroes, no white hats versus black hats. Everyone's dirty, everyone bleeds, and every victory tastes a little sour. European censors hacked away at scenes for excessive violence, while American TV airings in later years were a patchwork of cuts and edits. But here's the kicker. A Fistful of Dollars didn't just get away with it, it became a global sensation, inspiring a wave of spaghetti westerns that pushed boundaries even further. Leone's brand of violence was so influential that by the end of the decade, even American directors had to step up or step aside. And all the while, censors were left chasing after a revolution that had already left the station.
100 Rifles, 1969.
Take Jim Brown, Raquel Welch, and Burt Reynolds. Drop them into a Mexican revolution with a train full of guns, a mountain of dynamite, and absolutely zero interest in playing it safe. That's 100 Rifles, a Western that didn't just flirt with controversy. It kicked down the door and started a brawl. It wasn't just the steamy scenes, Jim Brown and Raquel Welch in a shower. For 1969, that alone made headlines. The violence in 100 Rifles is relentless. Villagers massacred, women brutalized, and gunfights that rack up bodies like a bad fever. Scenes of torture, executions, and full-scale battles pushed the film well past what most audiences were used to, and censors took notice. For TV and many international markets, entire sequences were clipped to avoid outrage, while others were heavily edited just to secure a rating. And let's talk about context. This was the late 1960s. America still struggling with civil rights, Vietnam on every TV screen, and here comes a film with a black hero and an interracial romance in the middle of a blood-soaked revolution. 100 Rifles wasn't just violent, it was subversive, a shot across the bow of both Hollywood convention and American social taboos. But here's what really matters. The movie went big, took the heat, and paved the way for future films to go even further. Some critics dismissed it as exploitation. Others saw it as bold, messy, and necessary. Either way, 100 Rifles fired off more than bullets. It fired up a whole new conversation about what Westerns could show, say, and do. And let's be honest, the censors never saw it coming. The Mercenary, 1968. Ever seen a Western where a Polish gunslinger, a would-be Mexican revolutionary, and a villain with a face made for nightmares all collide in a hailstorm of bullets and double crosses? Welcome to The Mercenary. Sergio Corbucci doesn't just serve up violence here. He crafts it into an art form that made censors sweat on both sides of the Atlantic. Right from the jump, this movie signals it won't play nice. Franco Nero's Sergei Kowalski eats lizards, loads dice down cheaters' throats, and guns down enemies with a kind of joyful cynicism. The violence is wild and unpredictable. Think scalpings, knife fights, and shootouts where no one's safe, not even the main cast. Then there's Jack Palance, chewing up the scenery, and nearly every other character as Curly, the ultimate sadistic gunslinger. What really set censors off, though, were the moments that pushed violence from the background right into the audience's lap. There's a notorious scene where a cheating gambler gets a mouthful of loaded dice. Literally, blood flows, teeth shatter, and audiences flinched. The UK and Australia trimmed minutes from the original release, snipping out scenes that critics called gratuitous and over the top. Yet, for all the carnage, The Mercenary isn't mindless chaos. Corbucci weaves in revolutionary politics, dark humor, and a sense of wild unpredictability that keeps you guessing who's gonna make it out alive. Spoiler, not many. It's a Western that didn't just test the limits, it laughed at them, dared the censors to keep up, and left an indelible mark on the genre. So if you thought spaghetti Westerns were all style, think again. Sometimes style comes with a body count, and The Mercenaries is enough to give even the hardiest lawman nightmares. OneEyed Jacks, 1961. You want a Western that kicked the censors in the teeth? Look no further than Marlon Brando's only directorial effort, OneEyed Jacks. On the surface, it's a revenge tale. Brando's outlaw, betrayed and left to rot in a Mexican prison, comes back for payback against his former partner. But what makes this film legendary isn't just Brando's wounded charisma or the windswept Monterey coast. It's the way it blurs the line between vengeance and sadism. When the violence comes, it's personal. Beatings, torture, and an infamous scene where Brando is publicly whipped, the blood running down his back in vivid color. It was all just a bit too real for early 60s censors, who trimmed the intensity for TV and foreign markets. And let's not forget the sexual undertones, suggestive content, that raised even more eyebrows among the conservative gatekeepers of the era. But the film's biggest crime? Honesty. One-Eyed Jacks was messy, raw, and never tried to give you an easy answer. The good guys aren't always so good, and when revenge is served, it leaves everyone cold. Critics were split. Some called it self-indulgent, others hailed it as a masterpiece. For Brando, it was his vision, unfiltered, and for the censors, that was one outlaw too many. Today, its blend of stylized violence and psychological depth feels ahead of its time, but in the 60s, it was a little too close for comfort. The Bravados, 1958, censored, re-edited in the 1960s. Let's get technical. The Bravados hit screens in '58, but its real brush with controversy came in the early '60s when networks and foreign censors started hacking it to bits for primetime airings. Why? This Gregory Peck vehicle goes hard on the theme of revenge, and it doesn't pull a single punch. The plot's a powder keg. Peck plays a man hunting down the men he believes raped and murdered his wife. The pursuit is relentless, the violence surprisingly graphic for its time. Lynchings, shootouts, and an execution scene that lingers long enough to make anyone squirm. TV censors in the US and UK weren't having it. They trimmed the more graphic moments, sanitized the ending, and in some cases, removed entire scenes involving the accused. But here's what really ruffled feathers. The Bravados isn't a celebration of vengeance. It's a warning about it. By the time Peck's character gets what he wants, nobody's happy. There's no triumphant music, no classic hero shot, just exhaustion and regret. For a late 50s, early 60s Western, that was a shock to the system. The Bravados became a sort of touchstone for what was too much for TV or a Sunday matinee. In a decade still clinging to old-school morality, its violence and the messy questions it raised made the censors work overtime.
Hombre, 1967.
Sometimes a Western gets under your skin, not because of how many people get shot, but because of what the shooting says about the world. Hombre, starring Paul Newman as a taciturn, ostracized Apache-raised drifter, is a case in point. It's not a bloodbath by modern standards, but for 1967, the violence and raw tension made censors sweat. When the bullets fly in Hombre, it's with a kind of cold inevitability. Ambushes happen suddenly. Hostages are threatened, shot, and killed. And in a scene that made TV censors especially nervous, a female character is held at gunpoint, manhandled, and threatened with violence in ways that were considered way too explicit for network broadcasts. Even some theatrical releases softened the most intense moments. But Hombre's violence is never random. It's about survival and the cost of being an outsider in a world that's already rigged against you. Paul Newman's performance is icy cool, but when he's finally pushed too far, his retribution is shocking and brutal. The climactic gunfight, with its deliberate pace and messy aftermath, leaves you with more questions than answers. The film was controversial, not just for its action, but for its message. Justice isn't always clean, and sometimes doing the right thing means getting your hands dirty. That's a message that didn't play well with all audiences, or censors, at a time when Hollywood was still figuring out how much grit people could handle. The Professionals, 1966. You want old-school stars in a not-so-old-fashioned bloodbath? The Professionals has Burt Lancaster, Lee Marvin, Woody Strode, and Robert Ryan running a rescue mission south of the border and leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. This is a Western heist flick that doesn't just flirt with violence, it takes it on a wild ride across the desert. There are shootouts, explosions, and fistfights galore. But what really sets The Professionals apart is its matter-of-fact approach to carnage. Heroes get shot, villains bleed out, and the camera isn't shy about showing the results. One sequence, where a character is tied to a wagon and shot in the back, was deemed too brutal for some TV broadcasts and was trimmed down. The finale, a blazing gun battle with heavy casualties, left critics talking about its gritty realism and left censors scrambling to soften the blow for prime time. But underneath the action is a sly, cynical commentary on loyalty and betrayal. The movie's heroes aren't exactly clean-cut, and by the end, nobody escapes unscathed, morally or physically. The Professionals was a hit with audiences, but censors kept a close eye on its violence and occasionally demanded edits for broadcast and overseas distribution. Hang 'em High, 1968. If you thought Clint Eastwood's move from Italian spaghetti westerns to Hollywood would tone things down, Hang 'em High is here to prove you wrong. The film opens with Eastwood's character being lynched. No cutaway, no mercy, just a noose, a tree, and a whole lot of ugly realism. For 1968, that scene alone was enough to have censors sweating bullets. But the violence doesn't stop there. Eastwood's character survives, only to dish out his own brand of justice across a landscape littered with corpses. Shootouts are filmed up close and personal, with blood squibs that made audiences wince. The hangings, beatings, and retribution all carry a sense of weight that was missing from the genre's earlier, sanitized fare. When it came to TV edits and international cuts, censors trimmed several of the most graphic moments, particularly the scenes of lynching and violent retribution. What made Hang 'em High so controversial wasn't just the violence, it was the message. Here's a movie where the law is as corrupt as the criminals, and where justice is doled out in rope and lead. By the end, you're left wondering who really deserves to live or die. Critics at the time called it harsh, uncompromising, and, in some quarters, too much for the Western's own good. But for Eastwood fans, it was a sign of things to come. The Unforgiven, 1960. Long before Clint Eastwood's later classic, John Huston's The Unforgiven was already making people uncomfortable for all the right reasons. Starring Burt Lancaster and Audrey Hepburn, this film is a powder keg of racial tension, frontier violence, and bitter family secrets. It might look like a prestige Western, but under the surface, it's about as raw as they come. The violence in The Unforgiven is both physical and psychological. There are attacks on homesteads, a massacre that leaves women and children dead, and a finale that turns the family's home into a bloody battleground. The camera doesn't flinch from the carnage. Wounds are ugly, deaths are final, and the violence is always personal. Censors in the US and abroad trimmed scenes for being too intense, especially those involving attacks on women and depictions of racial hatred. But what really upset the censors was the film's willingness to tackle taboo topics head-on. The Unforgiven is not just about gunfights, but about the violence embedded in the American experience, the kind of violence you can't wash away. Critics called it disturbing, unsettling, and too dark for comfort. For Huston, that was the point. For the censors, it was just one controversy after another. The Left-Handed Gun, 1958, censored for 1960s TV. If you think all 1950s Westerns were sanitized, The Left-Handed Gun is here to ruin your assumptions. This Paul Newman-driven retelling of Billy the Kid's legend is as psychologically violent as it is physically. When it landed on TV in the 60s, censors pounced. Newman's Billy is twitchy, damaged, and unpredictable. He kills not just out of necessity, but sometimes out of sheer rage, and the film doesn't shy away from showing him gun down his enemies in cold blood. The death scenes are more drawn out than the era's norm, and there's a tense lynching that left some audiences stunned. For its early 60s TV broadcasts, several violent sequences were either shortened or excised entirely, and some southern markets delayed airing the film at all. But what really sets The Left-Handed Gun apart is its unflinching look at the myth of the outlaw hero. Billy's not a misunderstood kid, he's a powder keg, and when he blows, people die. Critics were divided, but the censors were clear. This one needed a haircut before polite society could watch. The Outrage, 1964. You know you're in for something different when a Western borrows from Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon. The Outrage, starring Paul Newman, is a psychological, morally ambiguous tale about a murder, a rape, and 3 witnesses who can't or won't agree on what really happened. For censors, this was the kind of content that demanded special attention. There's violence, sure, gunfights, a stabbing, and rough justice. But what really made The Outrage controversial was its treatment of sexual assault and the ways characters talk about and react to it. The depiction of a woman's abuse, the intensity of the crime, and the confusion around what's true and what's justified forced censors to trim and sometimes outright ban the film from Family Hour TV in the 60s. In some regions, the film's most disturbing moments were cut for public decency. The Outrage didn't do big box office, but it left a mark for those who saw it, mainly because it dared to treat violence as something ugly and unresolved instead of a plot device with a neat bow. The result? It still hits hard today, and for censors back then, it was a headache and a half. Will Penny, 1967. By the late 60s, Hollywood was starting to get wise to just how rough and lonely the frontier really was. Will Penny is the proof. Charlton Heston plays an aging cowboy who just wants a quiet life, but instead finds himself in a nightmare, hunted by a psychotic preacher, played by Donald Pleasance, and his clan of deranged sons. What follows is a surprisingly intense, slow-burn Western that erupts into moments of shocking violence. There are ambushes, animal attacks, bloody brawls, and a tense standoff in a freezing cabin. The The violence is never stylized. It's awkward, messy, and always personal. One scene, involving a desperate struggle with a wild wolf, was trimmed for TV due to graphic realism. The climactic fight between Heston and Pleasance was often edited for its relentless brutality in international and later television releases. Will Penny stands out for its honesty. Life is tough, justice is often a joke, and violence has consequences. Critics at the time called it unsparing, and censors made sure to dull the blade before letting it air for home viewers. But the film's reputation as a grown-up, hard-edged Western only grew.
Otro.
So there you have it, 15 Hollywood Westerns that didn't just push the envelope, they crumpled it up and tossed it in the campfire. These films rattled censors, challenged viewers, and gave the Western genre its edge. Which of these frontier brawls left you stunned or wanting more? Drop your thoughts in the comments, smash that like and subscribe, and let's keep the wildest side of movie history alive. Remember, sometimes the most unforgettable stories are the ones Hollywood tried to hide.